So in today's video, I'm going to show you how I transform this into this. So let's get to it. So for the longest time, I've always wanted to build one of those arch cabinets. They're all over Pinterest right now and they look really cool, but I've always been kind of intimidated by the process until now. Now, more often than not, the material for the carcass of a cabinet is made out of 5/8 of an inch to 3/4 of an inch thick material, which leads me to my first issues. It's really not that bendy, which isn't ideal. So I ended up grabbing a couple of super bendy plywood sheets called Bendy Board. Now this stuff is really cool and it's super bendy. But this stuff is just under 1/4 inch in thickness, which means I'm gonna have to laminate a few layers together to get it to that 5/8. So next I can go ahead and rip down the couple of sheets of Bendy Board to just over the depth of the cabinet. Now I can glue these together to form an arch pretty easily, but to make it into a more uniform shape, I'm gonna have to make a jig. And for that, I got a full sheet of 1/2 inch MDF, which I cut directly in half with my track saw. And then on one of those halves, I marked out the exact size of the inside of my cabinet. I then, using my palm router on basically the end of a stick, I cut out the half circle. Now this is a very effective way to get a perfect circle, to which then I can cut off the remainder with my track saw. So now I've got the inside of the arch perfectly cut out. I can now go ahead and screw this to the other piece of MDF, and that way I can use that as a template to cut out another one the exact same size. So now that I got two cutouts of the inside of the cabinet, identical and perfect, my big master plan is to make a jig wider than my cabinet, so then I can laminate my layers together. So I'm gonna have to bridge these two together. In order to kind of help me with that, before I take it apart, I'm gonna drill some pre-drilled holes. So then I can go ahead and cut a whole bunch of 2x1s on my table saw, which I'll just screw to one side of the jig. So with some of the bridging pieces attached to one of them, I can go ahead and flip this one over and then start attaching the second one to it. So this is probably the biggest jig that I've ever made. So next, what I want to do is add some more of these bracings in between all the way around. Okay, so now that I have what looks like the reminiscence of an old school bird cage, to avoid any ripples in the final product, I'm going to line the top of it with some offcut of the Bendy Board. Okay, so now that I got the jig of the inside of the cabinet made up, I wanted to give it a dry run before I add any glue to it to make sure everything's gonna work properly. And for the most part, especially around the curb, using the strap, it pulls in real nice and tight, and I'm happy with that. But on the vertical sections, on the straight pieces, it doesn't really do too much. So to overcome that, I'm gonna bore some holes on the face, on the front and the back, so I can now clamp the vertical sections nice and tight, using a piece of wood to span the two. So with these pieces of wood that's going to help me clamp the Bendy Board sheets together, there's a little bit of a hack to them. So you see here that there's a little bit of a bow and there's a low point in the middle, and there's a really good reason for that. And that's because when I clamp the front and then clamp the back, I'm going to have good equal pressure here and here, but it's also going to be applying pressure in the middle too. So all that pressure all the way along is going to get those Bendy Boards glued together nice and tight. So now I can go ahead and apply an even amount of wood glue to each 3 pieces of the Bendy Board. And then once I've made a right mess with the glue, I can go ahead and sandwich the pieces together and then slap it on top of the jig and then clamp it down with these old ratchet straps I had kicking around. I also then used every other clamp that I had in the shop to get this thing nice and snug to the jig. Okay, so I got the arch all clamped in and it's been sitting here for a couple of hours, and I'm so glad that I did a couple of dry runs before, because I come to realize that I needed way more clamps than I needed. I basically clamped it anywhere that I possibly could, but I think it turned out pretty well. Okay, so now the stressful part is now over, at least for now, and I've let it dry for a couple of days over the weekend, and I think it's now is the time to remove the clamps and see if it holds together. So this turned out so good. It's holding shape way better than I expected it to. Like, it's literally perfect. So I'm stoked on that. I made a few marks where it's going to be attached to the vertical sections, so I made another mark a few inches down from that, cut them to length on my track saw, and then get it nice and flat on the jointer on one of the faces, and then bring it down to the exact width that I want on my table saw, without trying to poke my eye out, of course. Okay, so now the top section of the arch is complete and it's looking pretty good. I can now go make a start on the verticals and the bottom section. I then grabbed a sheet of 5/8 of an inch thick cabinet grade plywood, which is the exact same thickness as the arch. I then like to break my sheets down with my track saw slightly oversized. So then I can cut it to its final width on my table saw, because I always find that the table saw is a little bit more precise. And then finally cut them to length, just oversized with my track saw. So now the next step on this project is going to be to connect my vertical pieces to my arch. Now, I figured the best way for me to do this, and the strongest way for me to do this, is to do a wide half lap joint. So my plan is to cut the half lap on the curve first, because it's the most difficult out of the two. Mostly because it's almost impossible to clamp. So what I've come up with is this contraption here. So on my mark that I marked out earlier, I made a second mark, the exact distance from the tip of my router bit to the edge of my router. And then I've clamped it one end, as well as clamping it down there to a piece of material that's the same thickness as the actual curve, and it's holding up pretty well. I'm gonna go real steady with it, but I think that's gonna be totally fine. So with it all kind of ghetto clamped down, I can carefully remove the necessary material with my palm router to form the half lap. To which then I can clean it up with a nice but not so sharp chisel. And then with the joint cut out on the arch section, I can do the exact same thing on the tops of the vertical sections I previously cut. Just look at it. Isn't that joinery at its finest? No? Okay. Well, it looks like it's going to hold pretty well, so I can go ahead and cut the vertical sections to length. And I also cut a small dado at the bottom to hold the bottom shelf of the cabinet, to which I cut with my track saw and then screwed it together without putting any glue in there. So I have the bottom shelf temporarily fixed in, so that way it can help me stabilize the cabinet as I glue up these vertical sections to the top of the arch. So then I can go ahead and make another huge mess with a whole bunch of wood glue applied to both sides of the joint, and then temporarily clamp it together while I'll staple it. Now I use a bunch of staples here, a lot. I figured more the merrier because I want the joint to hold really well. Now with the stapled, I still need to clamp it together until the glue dries. So as always, I panic in these situations, so I clamped it the best I can. So in this tube here, I have an 8x4 sheet of real thin paper-backed white oak veneer. So I don't know how long this has been wrapped up inside that tube for, but as you can see, it's pretty damn wavy. Now I figured it's easier to get them flatter in smaller sections, so I cut them down just oversized of the depth of the cabinet. I then taped them to my nice flat bench, to which I can clamp them down with a nice thick heavy piece of plywood, and then I'm just gonna let it sit there for a few hours in hopes to get it nice and flat. So it's the very next day and I removed all of the clamps, and as you can see, we got a beautiful arch cabinet. Well, the outside of one at least. Now before I do any veneer work, I need to cut a small groove in the back of the cabinet to allow for the back panel. And to help stabilize and keep the shape of the cabinet, I wanted a fixed shelf near the top. So this is why I cut a small groove to allow for that top shelf. So now that I know the top permanent shelf fits, I don't want to attach it just yet because this groove is a perfect break for the veneer. As this whole run is a bit too long to get it all in one piece of veneer, it's nice to have a bit of a break so I can cut the top section and then the two sides separately. That way there's no weird transition because the shelf kind of breaks that up. Now to hide the seam of my perfect joint, I sanded it as flat as I can and then filled any of the low spots or the inconsistencies. So now that the filler has hardened and it is rock hard, I can now give it a quick sand so it's nice and smooth to get it ready to start applying some veneer on the inside of the cabinet. So to make it a bit easier on myself, I'm gonna lay the veneer down on my bench and then cut my section just roughly oversized, but with a nice square edge so that I have a nice reference to go from. Now there's a few different types of glue I can use for this application, but today I'm gonna be using this spray contact adhesive. Now the trick with contact adhesive and or contact cement is that you wanna glue both the back of the veneer and the area of the cabinet that the veneer is gonna be glued to. So once I've glued both the back of the veneer and the cabinet, I'm gonna let it dry for a couple of minutes. Now with this stuff, you wanna wait for it to become pretty much touch dry. So this side is getting there, but this still needs a couple more minutes. As you can see, it's real tacky.
So once the glue was finally touch dry, I could then carefully lay down the veneer, making sure that it's nice and parallel and straight. I then rolled out any of the bubbles using this huge roller, making it nice and smooth and a good bond between the veneer and the actual cabinet.
Okay, so now that the inside of the cabinet is all veneered and it's looking pretty sweet, I can now make a start on the back panel.
So I laid down a 1/4 inch thick sheet of white oak veneered plywood and then carefully placed the cabinet on top, making sure that it's nice and square, and then trace the inside of the cabinet all the way around.
Now if I go ahead and just cut this out, obviously it's going to fall straight through the back of the cabinet. So I made a second mark all the way around the depth of the groove at the back of the cabinet. So that way it can sit nice and snug in the groove once I cut it out with a combination of my track saw and the jigsaw.
I then carefully, and I mean carefully, used a minimal amount of glue all the way around to glue the cabinet together. You really don't want to make a mess with glue and veneer, it's such a nightmare to clean up.
Okay, cool, so now it's actually starting to look like a cabinet and I couldn't be happier. So with the inside all veneered, I'm gonna make a brief start on cleaning up the outside.
Now just like the inside of the cabinet, I sanded it down nice and smooth and then filled in any of the low spots, holes and stuff like that.
And then meanwhile, while that wood filler dries, I'm gonna take the time and start installing the shelves on the inside of the cabinet. For the shelf pins, I'm going to be using these little fancy boys right here. Now the actual shelf pin itself comes with a brass sleeve, which is 3/8 of an inch wide. So I have a drill bit the same thickness, and I made a little stop on my drill bit, you can see there, at the height or the depth that I want to drill these out. So that way I know not to drill too deep.
Now I love using these shelf pins because they're such an inexpensive little detail that adds so much pizzazz to your shelf pins. It just makes it look way more elegant.
And now with the shelves in, the filler has hardened, so then I can give it a quick sand, make sure everything is smooth around the outside, ready for veneer. Now for the veneer on the outside of the cabinet, as it's kind of tall and I don't have a 16-foot long veneer to go all the way around, I'm going to have a seam. Now I figured the best place for a seam would be right at the center, at the very top, where it's less likely to be seen. So I do have a square line at the top there, which is what I'm going to go to.
And just like before, I broke down the veneer just slightly wider than the depth of the cabinet and made sure to label the two tops of the veneer. So that way, when they meet up at the top of the cabinet, they will be somewhat book matched. And then just like before, applying glue to both the veneer and the cabinet, I could then apply the veneer to the cabinet, making sure that it's nice and flat and straight. I also find that this weird hip thrust motion technique works really well to get those air bubbles out. Now obviously I did the exact same thing to the other side, just making sure to roll it nice and flat and remove any of those air bubbles. And then once it's dried, I can then trim the veneer with my trim router nice and flush to the front of the cabinet.
Now this thing is looking pretty damn sweet, but obviously you can still see that the plywood core is still very much exposed. So I'm gonna have to cover that up with some kind of edge banding. Because we have an arch, makes it a lot more difficult, but I think the best option for me to cover up the arch is to make a segmented edge band like this one. Now in order to make this,
on my table saw I cut down a few rips of white oak just over a 1/4 inch in thickness. I then sanded them nice and flat and smooth on my drum sander. Now honestly, I'm way too dyslexic to figure the math out on this, so I found this pretty nifty calculator on Google called a bowl segment calculator. Now I asked you for a bunch of measurements and it will tell you the perfect exact size and angle of each piece that you need to cut. Now once I got my measurements, I can cut the strips of white oak into those section pieces, making sure to keep them all in order so that way the grain will run all the way through. I can then preload a whole bunch of tape and then carefully glue each of the segments together. Now as this thing is pretty much impossible to clamp, I'm using what's called filament tape, and this stuff is super stringy and it doesn't tear, so you can stretch it over the joint and it holds it nice and snug. I also taped it to my nice and flat bench and then used an offcut of the arch to make sure it all lines up. And then once it's dried, I can carefully mark and cut the edge banding to where it meets the straight run. And then once I'm happy, I can then go ahead and glue the edge band into the cabinet. And as always, it's a super difficult thing to try and clamp down, so I first off taped the edge band into the cabinet, and that wasn't really working so well, so I found the offcut of the arch and I used that.
Now, as a segmented section was originally one whole length of edge banding, and I kept them all in order, they're all in sequence, either end of this section will match either one end of the strips of edge banding that we have left over. So all I gotta do is basically line up the grains.
So once I figure that out, I can then mark and cut it to where it best meets, and you can kind of see here that the grain runs through, so then I can glue it just like I did before with a whole bunch of tape. So then after letting it sit overnight, I can then remove any of the clamps and all of the tape and then flush trim the edge band into the cabinet using my trim router. Now as my trim router couldn't get all the way around the cabinet, I had to do some sections with a nice sharp chisel, and then I can go ahead and finish off the remaining parts of the edge banding.
So now that the cabinet itself is pretty much at a point where it's ready for a final sand and finish, I think now's a really good time to make a start on those doors.
Now for the material of the doors, I'm going to be taking some wood out of my pile of solid white oak. Now this stuff is rough sawn, so obviously it needs to get nice and flat. To do so, I like to break it down into smaller sections, just slightly bigger than the components themselves, and then take it over to my shop to break them down even smaller, get them nice and flat on my jointer and nice and square, and then to the thickness that I need on my planer. Now I don't know what it is, but this process is always so satisfying to me. Just look at it.
So now that all my stock material is milled up and nice and straight, I'm going to make a start on the most difficult part of the door, and by now we already know what that's going to be.
Now to make a perfect arch section of the door, I have to make another jig. So using a scrap piece of plywood, I marked 1/2 of the outside of the arch. I also marked the very point at the top and the point where the arch straightens out. I then carefully cut out that mark just shy of the line with my jigsaw and then sand it perfectly smooth to the line using my sander. Next, I made a second mark the thickness of the door at 1.25 inches and then continued to cut that out the same way as before, sanding it down nice and smooth. And then once I had a nice smooth template, I then can cut it to its length and then test it around the cabinet, make sure it fits both sides and it's nice and smooth on the outside. Once I'm happy with that, I can then outline the template on a really wide piece of white oak and then carefully cut those out just shy of the line. So that way I can then carefully glue the template to the solid piece of white oak, and then on my router table with a template bit, I can then ever so carefully remove any of the excess material. And then after cutting it down to length, I should have a perfectly smooth arch section of the door.
Now that all the components are cut, they're all still a little bit long in length, but that's exactly what I want. So now I can start focusing on some of the joinery to kind of hold all this thing together. Now I'm going to make a start on the most simple joint, and that's connecting this radius to the hinge side vertical piece. And because the joint is pretty much going to be a butt joint and I want to keep it nice and clean and simple, I'm going to be using my domino.
Now you might think this is cheating, but I really don't care. So after finding the biggest domino that I could fit in the joint, I then cut out my dominoes and then dry fit the arch section to the straight section of the door. And is it really cheating if it works so well? I don't know, you tell me.
Now with those two simple joints done, I'm going to do the rest of them using this guy.
Now this is a shaker profile rail and style router bit. Now I really recommend this style of joinery because it looks and works so well, but I do recommend playing around with it first on some scraps until you get the heights all perfect. Not only does it act as all the joinery for all of your joints, but it also cuts a groove in for either a panel or glass like you would on any old shaker style door. And then once all the female parts of the joinery are cut, I can then make a start on cutting all the rails to length. Now to cut all the male parts of the joinery, I guess that's what it's called, I'm not too sure. I had to switch out for the other router bit. And again, like before, you want to play around and get all the heights all nice and adjusted and perfect. I also made this simple jig that all my rails will clamp to, that way I can slide it through the router table and it sits nice and square and nice and smooth to cut a perfectly formed joint. Now as always, I left the most difficult joint to last, and that's connecting these arch sections to the long inside stiles. Now as this is kind of a difficult thing to measure, I figured it'd be best to just lay it out on top of the cabinet, make sure that my gaps are all nice and perfect, and then just mark the pieces in situ. So then once I've marked the outside of the stiles, I can then add what's needed for the tongue section of the joinery, I think it's called a tongue, and then cut it to length on my table saw. So because this section is arched, my usual shaker door jig isn't going to work, so I had to come up with something else. Now the whole purpose of this jig is to hold the square section of my arch piece flush with the fence of my router table. I also didn't want any split out, so I added this offcut to help out with that.
Now this is either going to work great or it's going to be a complete disaster. I guess we'll find out.
So without forgetting to readjust the height of the router bit to allow for the thickness of the new jig, I can then carefully and smoothly run it through to cut the both male joints in the tops of the arches. Now this is the one joint that I was super worried about, but it actually turned out really well and it really wasn't that difficult. So once I'd cut out all the joinery of the door, I could then tape the outside sections of each door flush to the cabinet where it's going to sit when it's finally hung. That way I can mark out all the horizontal sections. Now my plan with the horizontal sections is to hide all of the shelves. So here you can see that I'm marking the shelves out, so that way I can get the center position of each one of the rails. Now for the next step, I need my bench back, so I removed the cabinet out of the way and then marked the center points of all of my rails. I then carefully did a dry run of the doors, making sure nothing snaps or breaks or looks weird. So that way I could super awkwardly cut the stiles to length. Like, what am I doing here?
So now that the frames are basically made up, it's now time for the task of gluing them all together. Now I've come up with this rig to kind of help me keep everything nice and straight and nice and square. Now I have this nice straight edge clamped to my bench all the way down. Now I also have this piece at the bottom which is perfectly square to my straight edge. So now that everything can get clamped to this, and it should remain perfectly straight and square, but that's not it. Now because anything that is round or basically not square, it's almost impossible to get a clamp to bite on it, which is why I have the negative of the arch from the jig that we made earlier, which is going to come in real handy. So now that I can clamp this way, and I can also clamp here down to my squared fence down at the bottom.
Now from past experiences, I've known to really prepare myself for any type of glue up, because usually I'll just rush into it and something goes wrong and I'm fighting the glue from drying and it's just like a complete disaster. So I wanted to be as prepared as I can for this glue up especially. Now it was still extremely stressful, but I think it went as well as it could have, and my main goal was to keep it nice and square and straight. So then the very next day I can remove them from the clamps and, well, yeah, I got two doors.
Now with the doors out of the clamps, this is starting to actually look like a bit of a cabinet, and I'm pretty damn impressed with how well it's gone so far. And I'm at the point in the project where it's a good time for me to start ordering the glass. Now, for me to order the glass, because I can't cut it myself, I have to template it. And then to template it, and to get the glass in the actual frames themselves, I need to remove this back lip and all of the openings on the back side of the doors. And that way I can replace it with beading once the actual glass is in position. To do this, I used a rabbit bit in my router table, and quite frankly, it's terrifying. Mostly because I went way too deep all at once, so if I was going to do it again, I'd do it in stages and do shallow passes. But once it was all fully cut out, I could then flip the doors over and then mark out the inside for my glass templates. Now here I'm using just some scrap pieces of hardwood, but anything really, it doesn't really matter. So as long as they are cut to fit nice and snug, I can then go and take these to the glass shop to get them templated. So now while I'm waiting on the glass to be cut, in order to stop the glass from falling out the back of the door frames, I'm gonna have to make up some glass stops. Now you'll notice that I left my corners rounded, and that's because I wanted to leave as much meat there as I could to make the joints as strong as possible. Now that does make things a little bit more difficult, but I can overcome that.
Man, I love my confidence here. Now after raiding my scrap pile of white oak, I found a few pieces that look similar in tone, color, and grain. And then I ripped them down to real thin strips on my table saw. Now using those thin strips, I can then place them on the back side of the doors and then mark out the cutouts for the glass. And then once they're cut to length, I can then mark out the little curved sections left over from the dado bit and then sand them down to match that profile. And then once I'm happy with all the vertical sections, I can then tape them into position just to kind of hold them there so I can mark out all the horizontal pieces and then sand them out the same way.
Now I got the rectangle sections of glass stop cut, and that was pretty straightforward, but this arch section, as always, is going to be a complete pain. And my first plan of soaking some glass stop and then clamping it to one of my jigs and letting that dry didn't really go to plan, so I have a plan B. So I'm going to do a similar thing to how I built the arch on the actual cabinet.
So I'm going to cut my thin strips of glass stop into even thinner strips. Now you can see here how much more flexibility they have when they're thinner. So after gluing a few pieces together, using the jig that I made to template the arch bit of the door section, I can then clamp them to the inside of that jig, which is the exact profile I need. And after a few hours later, I can then remove them from the clamps, and I was so surprised how well it held its shape. So I put it through the sander to get it nice and smooth, and you can see here how much more of a curve there is to my first attempt. So now I can go ahead and mark it and cut it out the same way as I did with the other glass stops.
So I can go ahead and finish off the rest of the glass stop and then make a start in trying to get this thing up off the ground. Now I'm going to make the base as simple and sleek as possible because I don't want to take anything away from this beautiful cabinet. And for the legs, to speed things along a little bit, I ended up buying some already milled dowel, which is the same thickness as the material that I just milled for the rest of the base, because they're all going to be joining together.
So I can go ahead and cut the dowel to the length that I needed for 4 of the legs. So you can see here, because they're round, they just roll around, they're not very stable, and it's going to be kind of awkward to cut in my joinery. So I made this little box so I can glue the 4 legs together to kind of lock them into one unit. I can then go ahead and mark out the joinery that I need for the legs and then cut them out on my table saw. Now this removes the bulk of the material, but I can clean them up nice and smooth with a sharp chisel. I can then go ahead and cut all the rest of the material needed for the base and join it all together using my domino.
Cheater.
And then once I'm happy, I can then go ahead and glue and clamp the base together. And then once the glue had dried, I can then remove the clamps, give it a nice sand all the way around, and then cut the legs to the length that I want. Now, as no floor in the world is perfectly flat, I wanted to add these leveling feet to stop the cabinet from rocking around. So once I've bored out a big enough hole to receive the leveling feet, I can then bore out a smaller hole to allow for the thread of the feet and to smash in this little connector. And then once the insert is in, I can then go ahead and adjust the feet to how it needs to be. Now, I repeated the steps on all 4 of the legs, obviously, and you can see here the difference it makes. So now to attach the base to the cabinet, I'm going to be using these figure 8 connectors. Now, one side of these figure 8 connectors connect to the base, and then obviously the other side connects to the underside of the cabinet. They work really well, and they allow for any kind of wood movement, not that I expect this thing to move that much.
No, I'm pretty happy with that, and I'm glad I went subtle. So the next step will be to get the hinges on the doors, and then the doors hinged to the cabinet.
Now, I got these hinges from a local hardware shop, and the position of the hinges were quite important, especially the top one. I wanted to make sure it got cut in just below the joint, so it supports the weight of that joint. Now, when cutting out hinges, usually I'll get the first 1 or 2 like perfect, and then the rest of them just nasty. So I made this little jig so I can cut out each of the hinges perfect. Now, using a template bit in my router, I can follow along my jig to get the perfect cutout of the hinge, if that makes sense. It's just a better finish. And then I can screw it up by trying to chisel them out nice and square with a blunt chisel. But it worked out, so that's okay. I'll repeat those same steps on the rest of the hinges on the doors. And then transfer those measurements of the hinges from the doors onto the cabinet, and then repeat the exact same steps on the cabinet. And then once the hinges are cut out, I can then finally attach the doors to the cabinet.
Okay, so I am stoked to be at this stage of the project. Doors on, looking sick, it looks like an arch cabinet, and it's been a journey. But we're not at the finish line just yet. Now that it's all assembled, it's time to take it all apart again, start the sanding process, ready to get it finished.
Now, sanding the doors is easy enough, but sanding the veneer of the cabinet is kind of difficult because you don't want to burn through the veneer, so you got to be nice and light with it. Now, for the finish of the cabinet, I went for months going back and forth trying to decide whether I wanted to use an oil, a clear lacquer, or a stain. And after doing multiple samples and multiple sleepless nights, you can see here that I ended up going for a lacquered finish, and I'm very happy with the results. Not to say an oil finish wouldn't suffice, it would have been totally fine. It's just, for me, in this situation, this worked best.
Okay, so I got all the parts back from the spray booth, and I've just picked up the glass, which means I can now start to get the glass into the doors.
So to start this off, I put a small bead of clear silicone all the way around the frame. And I mean small bead because I really didn't want it to ooze out all over the place. And then using some sexy ass gloves, I pushed the glass down into the bead of silicone in the hopes that I wasn't going to get fingerprints everywhere, but the gloves didn't really make any difference. I could then place the beading into position, and I swear this is the scariest thing I've ever done in my woodworking career. Pin nail the bead to the frame without smashing the glass, obviously. I then ever so carefully repeated those steps on all pieces of the glass. And then once the glass is in and the silicone had enough time to dry and cure, I can then carefully rehang the doors to the cabinet. Now, in order to stop the doors from opening on their own, I wanted to add these really small magnets. Now, one side of these little magnets get inset flush into the edge banding on the cabinet. And then the other side gets inset to the top and bottom of the doors. And you can see here they work really well. So finally, the next final step of this cabinet build is carefully add these little tiny handles
And that's a wrap on today's project, and I am so stoked on this thing. Now this has been a huge test both to my patience and my woodworking ability, and I'm extremely proud of the results. Now if you enjoyed today's video and you want to see some more of my other stuff, I have some more furniture builds up here and some more home renovation stuff down here. I also want to say thanks for watching today's video, and if you've got any comments or questions, please don't hesitate to ask me down below. And I will see you guys in the next one. Yep.